Coming up, shouldn't Canada be choosing liberal Muslims instead of radical Muslims when it comes to Syrian refugees? And later, I look into the Alberta NDP's war on farms. What's really going on there? It's November 26th, and this is the Ezra Levant Show.
Why should others go to jail when you're the biggest carbon consumer I know?
There's 8,500 customers here, and you won't give them an answer.
You come here once a year with a sign, and you feel morally superior.
The only thing I have to say to the government about why I publish it is because it's my bloody right to do so.
Welcome to the show. In a moment, we talk to two interesting conservative women about Syrian refugees. But first, what's really going on in Alberta these days? A new carbon tax? A massive tax on everything that moves, on everything that needs to be kept warm in the winter, on everything. Billions of dollars a year in a new tax, really as big as a provincial sales tax. But no mention of it in the NDP election campaign in May. Just a total sneak attack, really. And though it's awful and it'll cause people to lose their jobs because it'll tip already hurting oil companies over the edge, and then it will make life miserable for those unemployed Albertans. It actually, when you look at the math, it actually does not cap carbon dioxide emissions from the province. In fact, it specifically permits the oil sands to grow by another 30 megatons of CO2. To me, it's outrageous that the oil sands are artificially limited at all. It's outrageous that we're taxing something as harmless as carbon dioxide. Not just harmless, but necessary for all life on Earth. It's what plants breathe in. But if it wasn't part of the campaign platform for the NDP, and if it's not actually reducing Alberta's CO2 emissions, what's going on? What's the point? I'll give you my answer in a minute, but look at something else the Alberta NDP is doing at the exact same time. Bill 6, a bill that basically unionizes Alberta family farms, brings in the minimum wage, vacation pay, workers' comp, unions, that sort of thing. It wasn't in the election campaign either for the NDP, just another sneak attack. It's being rammed through the legislature at breakneck speed. Why? Is there a massive problem with Alberta farms and ranches that no one knew about for the last 150 years until the NDP got elected, with 90% of their MLAs from Alberta's cities and towns and 90% of their senior political staff actually commuting in from Toronto or Vancouver? Why the sneak attacks here? And to solve what problems? I say again, it's obvious Rachel Notley's carbon tax is anti-oil, but it won't actually reduce the province's CO2 emissions. And of course, it won't do anything to change the weather. Even she doesn't pretend it would. So really, it was a solution without a real problem. And same with this unionization of family farms. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, on a farm, everybody works. The whole family does. You work whenever the work requires it. You don't punch in and punch out with a time clock like at a factory. If there's a calf being born, you go out and deal with it, even if it's not your shift. When it's harvest time, you work from dawn to dusk. And these days, some combines even have bright headlights for nighttime work too. As in, there's no such thing as a 35-hour work week on a farm with coffee breaks and sick days and overtime paid during the harvest season. It just wouldn't make any sense. It's a family farm. Even kids help too. Young kids drive farm equipment. It's just the way it is, always has been. In fact, in Alberta, like all other provinces, it's actually legal for kids as young as 14 to drive farm equipment on the public highways, because that's life on a farm. The idea of unionizing a farm and bringing in minimum wage and hours per week is an idea so stupid. It shows a total disconnect with agriculture. But that's what happens when NDP mercenaries from the big city try to tell farmers how to farm. It would be like appointing a national fisheries minister from Saskatoon or something. But look, this war on oil and this war on farms is actually part of the same thing. It's the NDP's war on Alberta's culture as the freest, most entrepreneurial, least unionized, least subsidized, least regulated province in Canada. There was no problem with the oil patch. There was no problem with farming. The problem, in the mind of the NDP, is the oil patch itself, or the farms themselves. Once upon a time, the NDP in Canada was about working men and women, guys with hard hats. The NDP came from the CCF party, the Farmers' Party, way back in the day. No longer. Today, the NDP is the party of the University Faculty Lounge, the party of government civil servants. They're the party of unions, but not even the kind of union members who work in things like pipelines or ports. No real work, no outdoors work, no hard work. Today, the NDP is the party of white-collar fake unions, government unions whose workers live off the avails of taxpayers. Thousands of unionized workers have actually lost their jobs in Alberta this year in the oil patch. The NDP doesn't care about those workers, but not a single government worker has lost their job in the Alberta government. Not one. Rachel Notley cannot find a single government worker that she thinks oppressed taxpayers can do without. Look, this whole thing's a sham. There is no problem on Alberta farms other than that those farmers vote Conservative federally and Wildrose provincially. Look at this map here. The NDP is rushing through their farm unionization law so quickly, they demand to be passed by the end of the year because look at who they're after. The green there is the Wildrose. Look at their official list of public consultations. Most of them won't even start until after the NDP is done voting on this bill. Do you see what I'm getting at here? The NDP doesn't care what farmers think. These sham consultations, they don't care about family farms or the economics of how a farm works. They just care about pleasing their union friends. Usually sham hearings are done before a decision is made, like the fake survey the NDP set up for their carbon tax, a fake survey that was really a push poll that was open to people outside Alberta, et cetera. At least that oil carbon tax fake survey was before their announcement. Here on the farm thing, the fake hearings are after the farm bill will be voted on. And these hearings are being held in tiny meeting rooms that hold a small fraction of the number of farmers who want to come and tell these city slicker NDP politicians what life is really like on the farm. Look, the NDP doesn't care because the farmers themselves are the problem that is going to be fixed here. Everyone who shows up to the hearings, they are the problem. They are the enemy. And here's my point. Here's what pulls these two things together, the attack on oil and the attack on farms. It's increasingly clear to me that the NDP knows it will be a one-term government in Alberta. They were elected accidentally when the Jim Prentice PCs destroyed themselves and half-destroyed the Wildrose Party with Danielle Smith's defection. That won't happen again next time. Add in 100,000 lost jobs in Alberta and a new carbon tax, the NDP is not going to be elected again. So they've got 3.5 years to do what they really want to do, to de-Albertify Alberta, to kill its prosperity, not just the actual money-making part, but the underlying culture of entrepreneurialism, independent spirit, hard work, risk-taking, free enterprise. Kill that. Replace that with subsidies and taxes and rules and unions. That's what the carbon tax scheme is about, taking oil and gas to give a massive $3 billion a year bonanza to leftist green schemes. So you're taxing oil and gas, giving subsidies to green schemes. And on the farm side, destroy the last best refuge of rugged individualism and family tradition. The original Albertans, farming and ranching families, many of them would stretch back to the 1880s. Kill that too. In 2019, Rachel Notley will be returned to obscurity. The NDP will be banished from Alberta for a century. All the NDP staff from Vancouver and Toronto will go home with great war stories of how they helped destroy the province that the rest of the country loved to hate, how they brought down Alberta, brought it down to size. They want to destroy Alberta's character, cut down the tall poppy. That's what the carbon tax and the war on farms is designed to do, not solve any real problems. They think Alberta itself is the problem. Look, you've got to sign up with us to fight back. We've got 2 websites to click on. Here's the first one, stopthecarbontax.com. That's for our carbon tax fight. And here's the other one, savealbertafarms.ca for our farm fight. That's a lot of fighting, I know. But between those 2 campaigns, we have nearly 20,000 Albertans signed up already to take action. I hope you'll join us. Stay with us. After the break, we talk about Syrian refugees.
Looking for the perfect gift? Did you know the Rebel.media has a store? Make a statement with a t-shirt. Have your morning coffee in a Fearless Travel coffee mug. There's even an Ezra Levant bobblehead. It's a one-stop shop for the perfect gift. And don't forget to pick up something for yourself. Go to therebel.media/store to find out more.
Joining us now from Calgary is Michelle Rempel, the immigration critic for the Conservatives and the MP for Calgary. Nosehill, great to see you again, Michelle.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's been about a month since the federal election. First, give me an update. How did it go in your riding of Nose Hill? And what are your general takeaways from the election? Then I want to talk to you about refugees.
Well, whenever you're talking about a successful election in one's riding, you have to thank your team. And I had a very strong team and very strong showing in the election. We won with 60% of the vote. And some of the takeaways that I've got from people in my riding is that they are very concerned about the economy, they're concerned about deficit spending, and they're concerned about ensuring that their jobs are sustainable into the long run. One of my favorite quotes about being at the door was, "Of course we're going to vote for you, we want to keep working." So that's something that I'll certainly keep close to my heart as we proceed with this new parliamentary session.
Well, you're the critic for immigration, and that has seized the attention of the political class in the last month as Justin Trudeau has careened towards his campaign promise of 25,000 Syrian migrants by Christmas. Now, just this week, they blinked a little bit and said they're only going to bring 10,000 migrants by Christmas. The next 15,000 will get another 2 months. What's your take on Trudeau's plan?
Well, I think during the election campaign, the Liberals on this particular issue engaged in some unfortunate one-upmanship. I think, Ezra, everyone would agree that we want to, as a country, assist in humanitarian crises, but you need to have a plan in order to do that. And sort of picking this arbitrary self-imposed political deadline with a sort of a random number without thinking about how they were going to deal with that, I think actually did a big disservice, both to Canadians who want to help in this situation, but also to refugees that we are going to be welcoming to Canada. There are many unanswered questions. The cost that they put in their platform was $250 million. Leaked documents last week showed $1.2 billion. This week it's $650 million. They haven't talked to the provinces in terms of how much they're expecting the provinces to shoulder. So, I'm concerned about ensuring that there is a plan and will continue to keep their feet to the fire on that. I think that this is a hallmark of a lot of the things that were in the Liberal platform. There were a lot of promises and things sort of just rammed in there that really didn't have a lot of details attached to that. And I think that's what Canadians are going to be seeing as the Liberals begin to govern.
I think you're right about the cost. I think the number is going to be, it's always larger than governments predict of any stripe. But what's far more worrisome to me besides the cost, I mean, look, get used to the word billion being thrown around a lot for the next 4 years. What concerns me is the idea of vetting 25,000 people in 25 days in Arabic, in a country where there are few government institutions or databases, where corruption is rife, and where people just say, I don't have any papers, they were blown up. That is far more worrisome to me than $1 billion. And the fact that 25,000 refugees by Christmas is now down to 10,000 refugees by Christmas, that's still 300 people per day in a vetting that normally takes close to a year. Are you concerned that even with their scaled back number of 10,000 migrants by Christmas, that they're still lowering our standards in terms of security and background checks?
Well, first of all, when we heard reports that the screening, or at least part of the screening, was going to be conducted on Canadian soil, I think that was a huge concern. I think a lot of Canadians were going, wow, so you're going to invite people to Canada and then screen them here. What happens if they don't pass that test? So I'm glad to hear that at least they've committed to having most of the screening happen overseas. What I'm going to be looking for now is whether or not people who have best practice experience in screening, what they have to say, what officials who are going to be conducting the screening have to say, what CSIS has to say. And even things, Ezra, like we heard last week that they hadn't briefed the public sector unions that are going to be conducting the training. I think it would be pretty important to have those people understand and well equipped to be able to do the job. Those are the sorts of questions that, just because they held a press conference this week doesn't mean that they've fully fleshed out their plan. I think, talking about the volume and the speed, we need to ensure that those questions continue to be asked, and it's fair and it's reasonable to ask those questions. And I'm very pleased to be able to do so.
Michelle, I take your point about wanting to hear the answers from the experts, from CSIS, wanting to know the process. But after a certain point in time, expressing your interest in what the experts have to say, asking the right questions, if you don't get a good answer, at what point do you say, we don't have a good answer? And 10,000 people in the month of December is such an insane rush. It's not as insane as 25,000, but it's still an insane rush. At what point do you say, we haven't been satisfied, and this is dangerous? At what point do you move from asking earnest questions with a smile to saying, we oppose this?
Well, I think it boils down to the fact that Canadians do want to help in this situation, but also want to be assured of the rigorousness of that screening process. So I think your question is valid. We have to ensure that the Liberals are being transparent with Canadians about the screening process to ensure that Canadians feel confident that that is happening. We'll continue to push them on that, but I think it goes to show what you can do in opposition. We've been out on this issue for several weeks now, talking about the realities of trying to bring that many people to Canada in a very short period of time without thinking about these details. And I think, again, not to belabor this point, but I think it's one to be made. This is going to be a commonality, unfortunately, with a lot of the Liberal policy, or lack thereof, that was presented in their platform. So,
but do you think we can vet 300 people a day? Because that's the pace between now and Christmas, and then again on to February. 300 people a day. Do you think it's even possible to vet that many people that quickly from a terrorist war zone with spotty records and counterfeit records and corruption? Do you even think it's possible to do it?
Well, Ezra, our government did commit at the beginning of this year to an additional 10,000 refugees. That was in January of this year. A lot of the pictures that you've seen of Syrian refugee families coming to Canada has been due in recent weeks has been due to the work that our government did to both clear the backlog. We actually cleared the backlog of refugee application processing so that we could do some of that in real time. We also deployed more resources to our set up in that area to be able to do some of the screening. So the government is actually in a relatively strong position because of the work that we did. That said, this is, to your point, a large volume of people in a very short period of time. What I'll be looking for, they said that they're going to produce a plan. I actually haven't seen details on the screening outside of the fact that they said that they're going to do it. The biometric data that they're capturing, that'll be interesting to see how they're comparing it to other international databases and what they're using that for in order to screen people out. But I think, I'll be honest with you, that's a question for the government, Ezra. It's something that they have to be accountable to Canadians on. By pushing this timeline, they have to also ensure Canadians are safe. And my job is to make sure that we're asking those questions and demanding that as this process unfolds.
Now, it's one thing to check for terrorism and violence, but it's another to check for extreme ideologies. Radical Islam, for example, people who don't think men and women are equal, people who think that Islam should be supreme over other faiths, people who don't believe in the separation of mosque and state. I'm distinguishing between people who are terrorists or terrorist supporters and people who just ideologically are very hostile to the West, people who might morally support the terrorists but not actually give them any aid. Do you think we should be screening out for extremist ideologies? I'm separating that from actual terrorism. Should we ask people if they're comfortable with a multicultural, multi-faith society where men and women are equal, where we don't stone gays to death, where Jews don't have to pay the jizya tax? Do you think we should screen for ideology?
I think that it's up to every Canadian to uphold the principles that allow our pluralism to function. The question here, we've always been a nation that welcomes people into our borders. We are a multicultural nation. That's a reality. But we function that way because of some of the high-level principles in our pluralism. And you've just stated some of them. Gender equality, tolerance and religious freedom and religious practice. I think that the bigger question, Ezra, and the right question as we move forward as a multicultural country outside of the refugee issue, looking to the fact that we are going to have to look to immigration as we deal with our declining workforce and an aging population, is how do we ensure that Canada's pluralism continues in the long run. And for me, it's calling things out. Like when you have, I remember that there was, I think it was in the Greater Toronto area, there was a couple of soccer teams that were playing, and a couple of girls that were on it had to self-deselect from a game because one of the teams didn't want to play against girls. There needs to be outrage when something like that happens, but there also needs to be support and recognition that we are strong as a country because of our diversity. I don't think we should take, one way or the other. It's acknowledging Canada's pluralism, but also being smart about guarding it.
If we have two different refugee applicants, and one of them is in a niqab, the women do not believe that they are equal, the men don't believe that women are equal, they believe in Sharia law. And another family that are liberal, democratic Muslims, should we favor the liberal, democratic Muslims over the fundamentalist Muslims who believe in Sharia law? Like, should we have any preference for people who express liberal, democratic Canadian ideals?
Well, I think as a country, we've been successful in separating, religion from our state practices. We need to continue to do that. But the bigger question is, how do we ensure that, as I said earlier, principles like gender equality, like tolerance for a wide variety of practices, free speech, those sorts of things, are upheld and shared as values when folks come to Canada. And that's a question for our broader Canadian culture as we move forward. I think we have to be very careful about making general assumptions, but we also can't shy away from tough questions when they get raised.
Last question, are you worried about being called a racist? I mean, Ujjal Dosanjh, a Sikh man, former Premier of British Columbia, former Liberal cabinet minister, was furious with Kathleen Wynne, the Liberal Premier of Ontario, who implied that anyone who's against refugees is obviously a racist or a xenophobe. And Ujjal Dosanjh said, pardon me, that is not true. Are you worried, particularly because unlike Ujjal Dosanjh, he's a Sikh man, he's an immigrant himself, so obviously he's sort of bulletproof on that. Are you worried that the Liberals will simply label anyone who's worried about either terrorism or radical Islam? Are you worried about being called a racist?
Well, Ezra, a classic Liberal assertion is to go after the ad hominem attack, the personal attack, when a Conservative points out facts. And, I rest assured in the fact that the broad amount of Canadians, Canadians across the country want the questions with regard to security screening, how we are going to house and care for refugees to be asked. This doesn't mean that we are not compassionate, that we don't want to help. I think it's the opposite. But, to just somehow point fingers and call people names when they're asking pretty common sense questions, when we're talking about sunny ways and all of those sorts of things, I think it's actually a hallmark of a lot of some of the feedback that we get from the other parties on this. Mm-hmm. And my hope for this government is that we can work collaboratively, that they will respond to questions like this. I didn't read the exchange between Kathleen Wynne and Ujjal Dosanjh. I heard about it. That's really unfortunate, because I think that we talk about democratic deficit and having to change our electoral reform. It's that sort of stuff that actually needs to change. And certainly, I know that I'm asking fair questions. I am being reasonable, and I still have a desire to help Canadians and support our pluralism. So I know who I am, and I know who I am answering to, and those are my constituents, and that's what I'll continue to do. It doesn't matter what names I get called.
Right on. Michelle, by the way, I think it's Sunni ways, not sunny ways, when Justin Trudeau says it. Great to talk with you. I'm making a little joke. Michelle Rempel, immigration credit for the Conservatives. Look forward to talking to you again in the future. You got a big file, and it's a prickly one, and I wish you good luck with it. Folks, stick around. Thanks, Michelle. And we got more on the subject of refugees after the break. We've heard you loud and clear. You can't get enough Canadian Conservative news and opinion. Why not check out our blog? It's all your favorite Conservative bloggers together on a page called The Megaphone. Go to therebel.media/themegaphone or click on the Megaphone menu from our main page to check it out. Welcome back. I am delighted to be talking now with my friend Candice Malcolm, who is a fellow with Canadian Global Affairs and a columnist at the Sun Media newspapers. Candice, great to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
You have been writing about the refugee issue, and you have a very interesting perspective. Tell me, I mean, you come from the conservative side of things, but you're writing thoughtfully today as the Liberals are in power. What do you think the best way forward is to deal with this troubled part of the world, and what should Canada's role be?
Well, Ezra, I think that the refugee resettlement, it's an important aspect of Canada's role in helping Syria and helping the plight of the people in and around Syria and Iraq, but it's a very small component of it. I think a lot of Canadians, they see it as our role to welcome people and to help people who want to come and restart their lives in Canada. But you have to keep in mind that we're talking about millions of people who have been displaced and removed either through the al-Assad regime in Syria. They've been in the midst of a civil war for nearly half a decade now, plus the insurgent rises of other rebel groups, including the so-called Islamic State. A lot of these people would prefer to go back and live in their homes and return to their ancestral homelands as opposed to being picked up and moved to Canada. So yeah, sure, we can help resettle a handful here and there, maybe 10,000, as Trudeau has now done an about-face, and return back to the number that Stephen Harper had pledged on the campaign trail, which was bringing 10,000 refugees to Canada. But I think that Canada has a larger role in securing the broader area and helping the millions upon millions of displaced Syrian and Iraqis and other ethnic minority groups, including Yazidis and Kurds and other tribes like Christians as well. It isn't just simply opening our doors and saying, sure, we'll spend a couple $2 billion to help a handful live happily in Canada. I think that we also need to be focusing on what we can do to secure Syria itself.
And that's the thing is 10,000, 25,000, that is a drop in the bucket of people who are displaced. I mean, millions of people displaced or having some trauma, and that's just Syria. And as you mentioned, there's Iraq. And listen, if you want to look for refugees around the world, there are plenty of other battles right now that don't have the globe's attention from which refugees stream. I think the only permanent answer is to try to help solve the problems on the ground, to fix it so they can stay home. But even if we can't do that, Canada simply cannot take every refugee in the world that wants to come here.
Right, and the ones that do get to the front of the line, Ezra, aren't necessarily the ones that are the most in need. It's the same as the folks that are streaming into Europe. The people that have the means and the ability and the money, frankly, to get themselves out of Syria, out of the refugee camps and into Europe, those aren't the ones that are the most in need. Even the people who are already secured in the UN camps, so the ones that Canada selects to resettle into Canada, we choose them from these refugee camps that are administered by the UN. Even those people, at least they're physically safe. That they might be living in not the best circumstances, living in a poor country and whatnot. But at the same time, at least they're safe. Some of the people who are in the most danger, we're talking about the Yazidi Kurds that are being surrounded by advancing Islamic State forces. Those are the people that are in the most need, and we're not talking about helping them. We're talking about helping the ones that are already at the front of the queue, sitting in a UN camp. So again, I think that when Canada's talking about what we can do to help the least well off in the situation, the ones that are at the biggest risk, the people who are at risk of genocide and war crimes at the hands of the Islamic State and the al-Assad regime, it frankly isn't the people in the refugee camp. So we can do a little bit to help those folks, bring some of them to Canada and help them have a better life. But when we're talking about the broader picture here, the refugee resettlement issue is really just a drop in the bucket.
You're right. And one of the things that's troubled me so much about the migrants rushing to Europe is it's obviously a first come, first serve. Whoever is the strongest or the most able to scheme a plan to get there. So not surprisingly, it is 3/4 male, young men who are physically able or wealthy or just able to move. It's just so obvious a first come, first serve approach in Europe, but that's not our traditional definition of refugees. Let me put a question to you. I just asked Michelle Rempel, the conservative critic for immigration, a couple of questions, And they were really tough questions for her, and I can understand as a politician why she didn't give me a straight answer, but maybe you can give me your answer to them. I said to her, it's one thing to screen and to vet the background of would-be refugees for links to terrorism. Are you, on a police list of some sort? Are you part of a terrorist group? That's, a minimum standard to screen. But what about people who morally support terrorist groups, or people who are just radical in their approach to Islam? They believe in Sharia law. They don't believe in the separation of mosque and state. They think that Islam should be supreme over other religions. So I'm not even talking about people who are violent. I'm talking about people who don't have our Western liberal democratic tradition. I asked Michelle Rempel, should we be screening for ideology, for compatibility? I think of some of my absolute favorite Canadians, liberal Democrats like Raheel Raza or Tariq Fata. These are truly liberal Muslims who love Canada. That's a very different kind of person than I think some of the people who might be presenting. Should we be screening for that?
Absolutely, Ezra. I don't even think that that's a question. Of course, when we're talking about people who are going to be successful in Canada, we have to look at a number of things. And the refugee resettlement process, it isn't just a matter of, doing the security and background checks at the time, letting them come to Canada, and then that's the end of the story. The resettlement process is a long and costly one. Canadian government spends $1 billion a year on refugee resettlement services. So that's language training, education, job training, even sometimes housing. And I think that the compatibility issue is important. So if somebody has sympathies or affiliations or thinks positively of the so-called Islamic State, then no, they shouldn't be welcome to Canada. I think that when we're talking about 6-7 million displaced Syrians, we can be selective if we're only going to select 10,000 or 25,000 per year. I think, some people, obviously it's a civil war situation. People have different affiliations based on their religion and their tribe. Not everybody who's necessarily from one religion or one tribe has radical Islamic tendencies, and hopefully when they come to Canada and they see our peaceful, pluralistic society, that they'll decide to become more liberal and more tolerant and more open-minded to their neighbors and their fellow Canadians. But at the same time, somebody who's already ingrained with an ideology, those are certainly not the kind of people that we should be selecting. We could be choosy, Ezra. We have the luxury of time and space, physical space, to be able to select who we want to bring to Canada. And I think that the government should be selecting based on these kind of criteria.
Wow, I really appreciate your forthright answer. I wish that Michelle Rempel gets some of your courage. It is not un-Canadian to say we want refugees to be Canadian. In fact, to bring in people to, if there are millions of people that we could be selecting from, it would be un-Canadian for us not to choose the Liberals and the Democrats and the people who believe in the equality of men and women. I appreciate your words, Candice. Great to see you. I hope to keep in touch with you in the months ahead.
Great. Thanks for having me, Ezra.
Take care, my friend. Stay with us, folks. After the break, your viewer feedback and my thoughts on that.
So open-minded that the brains have fallen out.
What's the point that you're making?
The point that I'm making is that if you're going to propose a massive overhaul to the way the economy is developed in terms of carbon tax, cap and trade, other forms like that, it helps to have some science that is in fact settled.
Welcome back. Highlight of the show is your feedback to me. Kevin Morris writes, great show. I can hardly wait to pay for it. Instead of being forcibly taxed to death by NDP, I gladly pay for a valuable service, the Ezra Levant Show. Hey, that is so friendly of you. Thank you so much. As you know, we are working out the wrinkles in our show, an hour a day or so from me. Faith Goldie's going to start soon. We got a couple other shows in the works. My goal is to see if we can do this every day and get a little better, iron out the wrinkles, bring in some more shows, and then put these long-form shows in a members-only area and charge $8 a month for them. But don't you worry, All the other little video bites that we do throughout the day will remain free forever. You'll never have to pay to get access to that stuff. It's just the long-form TV-style shows that we're going to put behind the members area, but that's not going to happen for at least a month. So enjoy it while it's free, and I appreciate your moral support and your offer of financial support. Daniel Wild's comments, he says, so great to see Michael Schmidt. I was enraged to read about what was happening to him in the local news. You can count on my crowdfund contribution once it's set up. As for breaking up the show into segments, that is not a bad idea. However, leave both options, watching the full show or watching segments. Thanks for your feedback. On Michael Schmidt, I should tell you that I have spoken with one of my favorite civil liberties lawyers here in Ontario. Do you remember Sonia Schickman? She helped us fight for Reverend David Lynn's freedom of speech and freedom of religion down in Yonge and Dundas Square. Well, she's agreed to look over the case, and if it's what she expects it to be, she has agreed to take the case. Now, we've got to connect her and Michael Schmidt to make sure they get along as client and lawyer, but the wheels are moving. You know, I don't care about raw milk. It's not my style. Frankly, I would never drink it. I like my milk pasteurized. That's not what this is about, people. This is about economic freedom, about property rights, and about a paramilitary style armed invasion of a guy's farm because he wants to drink milk, you know, good Lord. And now spying and surveillance on him. I'm on his side for the civil liberties. He can keep his milk. By the way, one last comment. Thanks for your tip about breaking up the show. That's one of the things we're figuring out over the next month. Do we have the full half-hour show and then break it up into bits? We'll get there. Hey, Sally Ferguson made this comment. She said, hilarious that Irrelevant thinks somehow he or other racist right-wingers had anything to do with Justin changing his mind a little on the refugee crisis. Well, look, I mean, calling people who are concerned about security racists is so obviously name-calling, and it's so obvious, it's like flying a flag saying, I don't have any arguments, so I'm going to name-call. I mean, why don't you just call me a dummy? But it just doesn't work. I mean, Ujjal Dosanjh, who is Sikh, he was born overseas. He is an immigrant to Canada himself, who served as the NDP Premier of BC and then as Liberal Cabinet Minister. He's concerned too. Are you going to call him a racist? It is not enough to call people who are afraid of radical Islam and terrorism. It's not enough to say you're racist. You know, that word Islamophobia, if you really look at it, it means fear of Islam. Well, yeah, if you're not afraid of radical Islam after the Paris attacks, after 9/11, after the storming of our own parliament buildings and the murder of Nathan Cirillo at our National War Memorial, if you're not afraid after the Toronto 18, after 7/7 in London, after the Bali bombings, after the daily attacks in the Middle East, if you're not afraid of radical Islam, there's something broken with you. And saying you're afraid doesn't make you racist. Now, I think it behooves the Liberal government to screen our refugees properly. And I enjoyed my conversation with both Michelle Rempel and with Candice Malcolm. And I know that my questions to Michelle, I could see the gears turning in her mind. They're so obvious to answer. If you had two refugee families and neither of them was terrorist, but one of them was into niqabs and Sharia law and Islamic law and no separation of mosque and state, and the other were great liberal Democrats, Muslims who can hardly wait to get to a free country, how on earth could you not say you're going to choose the liberal Muslim family? I'm not saying don't take Muslims. I'm thinking, how about take Muslims who've reconciled their faith with modernity? I mean, we call that the Enlightenment in Judaism and Christianity. It's so bizarre to me that a conservative politician in opposition is afraid to say, yeah, we'll go with the liberal Muslim family. And that was the difference between Michelle Rempel, who's still in, what's the media going to say mode, and Candice Malcolm, who as a pundit and a Toronto Sun columnist is free to call it like she sees it. Anyway, I thought the interviews were interesting. I'd like to hear what you thought about them. Don't be shy to make your comments in the comments section underneath this video. Last thoughts. My mind is on Alberta. I know I'm here in Toronto. I know the refugee issue is national. But terrible things are going on in my home province of Alberta. It's not just the carbon tax. When you say we're banning coal, we're making it illegal to work in coal, you know, that earns you a nice letter of kudos from Al Gore, but it puts hundreds, maybe thousands of families out of work. This, especially in the coal mining industry, who knows how many more oil and gas layoffs, and now they're coming for the family farm. I want to fight back. We're still figuring out how. We ordered our lawn signs for stopthecarbontax.com. More than 10,000 people have signed the petition. More than 1,000 people have requested signs. My first batch of signs that I've ordered is 2,500. We have more than 100 sign captains. We expect to have these lawn signs shipping by the end of next week. So you should be in a position to get your stopthecarbontax.com lawn sign as soon as the end of next week. We also started a petition called Save Alberta's Farms.ca. Save Alberta Farms, not savealbertafarms.ca. And this is a tough one. We have to figure out how to act quickly because they are rushing this unionization of farms through the legislature. They're racing to do it before Christmas. I should tell you, I've reached out to a pro-farm lawyer in Alberta today to see if there's some way to fight back. I don't have a concrete answer there yet. We are paying attention to these. If you're not from Alberta, you might be saying, well, what's that got to do with me? Well, it's got two things. First of all, a loss of freedom anywhere in Canada is a loss of freedom everywhere. And what happens in one province spreads to another. And by the way, Alberta has been the economic engine of Canada for years. To have it hobbled is going to hurt every Canadian in the pocketbook, not just morally. A lot to talk about. I'm so glad you watched. Stay tuned. Give me your comments. That's it for today's Ezra Levant Show. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night, everybody.